I'm going to get started. So hello and thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the National Adaptation Forum's virtual Climate Displacement Forum hosted by EcoAdapt. I'm Molly Johnson, one of the forum organizers and your organizer for today's webinar on migration and receiving communities. For those of you returning to the series, welcome back. And for those of you who are just joining us, I'd like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. So to help us reduce feedback, please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute, even if you're using the microphone voice over IP option. Please use the question function on your control panel to submit questions to the presenters throughout the webinar. Please also use that question function to report any technical issues you might be encountering. We will be recording and posting this webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing, and the webinar will be available online next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. Today's slides and presenter information are available for download in your Presenter Handouts tab. And finally, throughout this series, we'll be compiling a resource page on climate displacement for attendees to also be shared with the larger adaptation community. So you can make suggestions to the resource page by following the link in the chat box. And before we begin, I would just like to quickly acknowledge that there are many people across the U.S. experiencing immediate threats to their lives and livelihoods due to climate change impacts. This series is intended to provide a holistic view on climate displacement, but cannot be representative of all the people and communities facing or working on this issue. We encourage you to share about your work and your experiences here today via the questions function, as well as in our online networking platforms. And we also want to sincerely thank you for attending today, despite all of the challenges and uncertainty due to the ongoing pandemic. So I'll now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, David Flores, who is a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Progressive Reform. Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited for you all to be joining us today in what is the fourth installment in this Climate Displacement Forum. The topic of today's webinar is climate migration in the receiving community. I suspect you've all, for those of you who've joined the earlier portions of the forum, have already learned quite a lot about displacement and relocation. We are being joined today with a really incredible panel, I'm very excited for, of researchers and advocates who are going to present in sequence during the first part of this hour. Our panelists include, in sequence, Dr. Matt Hauer, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, an affiliate for the Center for Demography and Population Health at Florida State University. Dr. Fernando Rivera is a professor of sociology and a director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. Maria Perales Sanchez is with the Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, which is based in Mexico in the United States. And lastly, Dr. Kim Mosby is a sociologist and urban planner with the Louisiana State University Coastal Sustainability Studio. So as I mentioned, the topic today's webinar is climate migration in the receiving community. And as I expect, we'll come to learn that there are transnational immigrants and domestic migrants that have been, are presently, and into the future in increasing numbers, migrating to destinations in the United States. Large cities, towns, and even rural landscapes are their destinations. And for this huge phenomenon, there are a number of big questions that I think we'll be confronted with today. At the national scale, what should be that policy response? And the smaller question, though not insignificant, especially for those towns and cities with comparatively fewer resources or experience within migration, how they need to prepare for to accommodate immigrants and migrants driven in part by climate to their localities. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Matt Hauer. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's really wonderful to be here to talk about some of my work, especially around climate migration. I'm going to use sea level rise as my sort of the focal point. It's where most of my research has been in, but I think it's illustrative of broader sort of climate migration patterns and trends. So while it is about sea level rise, many of the same lessons around sea level rise apply to other types of climate stressors broadly. So I'm going to try and emphasize those kind of patterns. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that what causes or what is behind the impetus behind any kind of climate migration is rather complex. The reason why anybody moves is not the result of one single factor. It's a multitude of factors that kind of come together before somebody makes a decision to migrate. And here we've just plugged in things that would be related to sea level rise, like inundation or erosion and so on. But there's a whole host of factors. It's not just the environmental, it's not just climate change, but it's how it interacts with economic outcomes, social outcomes, political, whether or not you're migrating for a reactive reason versus an anticipatory reason, so sort of being displaced by a storm versus deciding that an area is going to be either too hot or it's going to be underwater in the future. And then there's also obstacles and facilitators in there as well that might keep you in place by reducing your risk or might facilitate a movement out. So managed retreat is a very famous example of this. So it's a whole, I want to emphasize that it's not just one factor that might be driving climate migration to think about. So you can't just look at extreme heat and say, well, extreme heat is going to drive a lot of people out of Arizona. It's a large combination of factors that go into what might drive migration. Now, with that being said, there's two overarching themes inside of here that don't appear on this exact chart that I want to emphasize. So if we move to the very next slide, these are that when people do make a migration decision, when they do decide to migrate, the choice and the destination tends to be driven by pre-existing networks of social capital and kin networks. And so what I mean by that is people tend to move where their friends and their family already are. And the other factor that's inside that would be the kin network. The social capital network is also related to sort of economic outcomes. People tend to move to locations where they can have sort of enhanced social capital going forward. So those two are inside of there. And then on top of that, when people do choose to move, they tend to move to relatively nearby locations. So if you think about sea level rise as being a stressor and an impetus for people to move, it shouldn't be very surprising to say that people would be more likely to move to Atlanta from a coastal community than to say Kansas City, right? Because Kansas City is a lot further from the coast. So when you think about environmental migration and you think about as a receiving community, there's two other factors to consider, right? And so inside of this established kin network and inside of this proximity, if you go to the next slide, you need to think about how many people in an area could move, how many people could be displaced, and then where those people are located relative to a destination. So in terms of a rocky coastline as it relates to sea level rise, Maine it's not under as much threat as, say, coastal Louisiana. So how many people is related to this? And then, if people do move in Maine, they're less likely to move to California than they might be to move to New York, right? Sort of that proximity plays a role. Now, when we talk about a major climate stressor, again, I'm going to use an example of sea level rise. We're talking about very large volumes of people in the United States. If we look at the next slide, this shows the anticipated amount of people that would be underwater over this century by 2100, assuming two amounts of sea level rise, about 3 feet in the orange, and in blue would be about 6 feet or so. And so by the end of the century, if growth patterns are similar to what they've been over the last half century, we're looking at about 13 million people by the end of the century that could move on the high end. and about 4 million people that could move on the lower end. Also, if you notice that most of this migration occurs in the latter half of the century when most of the climate impacts are the highest, right? That's when sea level rise curves really start to accelerate. That's when we look at extreme warming in the amount of heat that could occur, right? The days over 100, and so on, the heat index days. The larger volume of those of the climate stressors tend to be in the latter half of the century, in which case it starts to kind of overwhelm, right? You can see that the growth under both curves get very aggressive towards the end of the century. The other thing I want to emphasize too is the locations of where people might actually move from. So if you're hoping to receive a stream of climate migrants into your community, you want to put in policies in place to welcome them. Thinking about your relationship to what that climate stressor might be, where that's located, is just as important as putting those policies in place. And so as you can see, the Gulf Coast, the U.S. South, and then major metropolitan areas are where we see most of that migration actually originating from. Here's the breaking it down, that 13 million number. As you can see, Florida is about half of that, followed by Louisiana and so on, California and so on. So if you click it one more time, these are the states. One more. So proximity to these types of states would be very important if you're looking to be a receiving community or anticipating a receiving community because of something like sea level rise. The closer an area is to Florida, Louisiana, California, New York, and so on, the more likely you are to see in-migration, knowing nothing else about underlying patterns, just knowing the importance that proximity plays. If you go again, you'll hear a lot when it comes to climate stressors about who's at, where are the most threatened areas and so on. And I just want to emphasize the importance of relative versus absolute risk. So these are the areas that have the highest relative risk to sea level rise. And so you'll find this regardless of climate stressors. Some areas are very, very much at risk to a climate effect that might spur migration. But they could be very rural areas, in which case the volume of people might be relatively low. If you click 2 more times, you'll see that Broward and Miami-Dade counties in South Florida, they have a much smaller relative risk, in some cases a third or half of what you see in parts of Louisiana, but the volume of people is so much larger than what you see. And so relative risk plays an absolute risk in terms of who actually might move. That's getting a handle on the broad picture is real important. So then where are these people likely to go? Well, it's really easy to follow kin networks and establish patterns. And pre-existing networks play a very large role in any kind of destination selection, whether or not it's sea level rise or climate change, or just for general reasons, like when people actually move. And I've put up 3 sample networks in a spider diagram, is how we would call this, for Eagle County, Colorado, Assumption Parish, Louisiana, and Doherty County, Georgia. And I want to emphasize that it's not that everyone will go short distance, it's just that the balance of people tend to move short distance. So you will see people move to destinations that seemingly don't make a lot of intuitive sense unless you know things on the ground. Unless you know that people do move from Assumption Parish, Louisiana to Buffalo, New York, if people are moving there because of climate change, it seems crazy in some sense, but at the same time, people already are. So I just want to emphasize that just because short distances are an important role in it, it doesn't mean that everyone will move short distance. So if we aggregate all of these up, all this sort of migration pathways up, this is the picture that we get. If we go to the next slide, this is a nice circular diagram of where people might move to because of a climate stressor. The thing what strikes me the most about a figure like this is the very large volume of people who move within states. So these are organized clockwise around the face based upon the total number of out migrants. And then they're colored as the top 10 sending areas for sea level rise. And so Florida is the top sender. It's also the top receiver of sea level rise migrants. And it's short distance migration that plays a very significant role. There is some cross-state migration, and there is not a single state in this diagram that is not represented. Every single state receives some number of people. Sometimes it's more significant than others. If we look at this on a map, you'll see that pretty much these are counties and metropolitan statistical areas. Everywhere should expect some level of climate migration. This would be on the very next slide. Hopefully the maps are coming up. Every area should experience or should expect some amount of climate migration because of sea level rise. It's just that some areas tend to be larger senders than other areas, which might be larger receivers. So you can see South Florida, South Louisiana, and so on being major senders. The Tidewater region in Virginia would be another one. And you can see the major metro areas that are major receivers of migrants, especially inside that southern sort of border, sort of nearby the coast, but not quite coastal. So I wouldn't consider Atlanta coastal, but I would say it's a lot more coastal than, Denver, and so on. When you aggregate these up to state effects, some states are much larger, quote, winners than other states where they tend to lose more population. Texas, Georgia, North Carolina being the ones that would see the largest gain. Florida, Louisiana, and New Jersey seeing the largest loss. This would be the very next slide. People will adapt, so adaptation will occur. The other thing to think about in terms of whether or not people are going to move or not. But in some cases, adaptation, it's not a strong enough pull. So on the tails of this distribution, there's not a whole lot of change. If you go to the very next one, most people are still migrating to major destinations. Now, there's other climate factors that are at play in places like Phoenix and in Austin, in Orlando, aside from just sea level rise. It's just, we haven't quite gotten there yet in terms of the modeling. And the last thing I want to emphasize as well is that this is not something that is far off into the future. Climate change is an immediate hazard, and I'm fairly certain that people are already making these decisions to migrate. This is a great quote from a few years ago in the Washington Post about Norfolk, Virginia. This is a church pastor who was interviewed and said, "I don't know many churches that have to put the tide chart on their website so people know whether they can get to church." And so presumably the amount of coastal flooding in Norfolk is continuing to accelerate, and I'm sure it's going to affect whether or not people will stay in Norfolk. And if they do go, the kind of locations will generally be nearby and areas that have hopefully some sort of economic vitality. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That is such a valuable and excellent overview. I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Rivera. Fernando, thank you for joining us.
And thank you, and thank you for the opportunity and great introduction by Matt. And I'm probably gonna talk about some of the things that he brought up in the case of Hurricane Maria, and serve Orlando and the Central Florida region as one of those receiving communities. But one of the things before I start, I just want to briefly mention some of the work that I do, and serve even the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. As you can see the description there, I think some of the catalysts of this venture, it can be described as part of the influx that Hurricane Maria had in the region. Basically, when it became apparent that a large number of people from Puerto Rico were moving here. And if you can see, and you can briefly, next slide, look at some of those issues and sort of some of the anchors of it and sort of the academic research has been disaster response and recovery. But it's in a sense sort of that response to some of the issues that are definitely going on in terms of the displacement of people due to climate change. So next slide, please. Next slide. So I'm not gonna assume. I'm not gonna assume that you know where Puerto Rico is and in relation to Florida out here. But you can see that Puerto Rico and particularly Orlando is separated roughly by 1,200 miles out here, and the relationship between the two is it continues to be very strong. So kind of like that issue of social networks, kick networks are vital to the decision of a lot of people to move out here. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that in terms of looking at the population out here, although Hurricane Maria brought about sort of a high jump, if you can say, in terms of the people moving to the area. It had been constantly growing out here since 2006 or so. So kind of like that idea that it's not only one single event out here. In the case of Puerto Rico, the issue of economic crises that are compounded by some of the climate issues continues to push a lot of people to make the decision to come to the Central Florida region out here. And as you can see, next slide, basically the destination for Puerto Ricans is Florida. So kind of like sort of that, kind of like in the case that Matt was saying in terms of sea level rise, that Florida might be losing some population, but might be gaining in other sense in terms of that. So this has been happening out here, and you can see that this is before actually Hurricane Maria. So why are people coming to the area out here? Next slide. So you see sort of those reasons, right? Particularly jobs, basically they have family, they want housing, they want to retire, and other reasons. Obviously, climate change or climate migration doesn't go, it's not in the top 10 of the reasons that people put out here, but we know that there are some of the social factors out here. What make this area so attractive to Puerto Ricans when they have to make that decision to move? So we're talking that already a place with a large Puerto Rican population, a perceived better educational system, more job opportunities, and inexpensive housing out here. So go to the next slide. Obviously, a lot of these things changed with Hurricane Maria in September 20th of 2017, and obviously prior to that, Hurricane Maria, Irma, in terms of that. And now we're seeing sort of what are the policy ramifications and sort of the issues that go on in one sort of the migrating community and the receiving community out here. So this, so some of the issues that force a lot of people to temporarily or permanently move was sort of the perception that the government was not there. Basically, people had to rely on each other. And basically, in the case of Puerto Rico, when there was no electricity, there was no communication, those first 3-4 weeks were vital out here. So people perceived that they were on their own in terms of making these decisions out here. And then all of a sudden, Central Florida in particularly sort of became sort of that place out here. As you can see, sort of the trends out here in terms of this relationship between economic issues that are going on and sort of the relationship of the movement of people from Puerto Rico, it becomes out here. So we see that as Puerto Rico loses population, there's gain in the continental United States out here. And you can see some demarcations out here in terms of economic crises, climate events going on out here. And obviously, the big question that we might have, what's going to happen out here in terms of COVID-19 and some of the issues that are necessarily going on out here. So in terms of the receiving community, obviously we knew that Central Florida was already a magnet for the Puerto Rican population out here. So for Hurricane Maria, there was this activation of those community groups out here that took it to themselves, basically what we can do in terms of the issues out here. So local community groups, nonprofit groups, basically putting their resources together, and there all of a sudden became sort of a vital place of support to bring supplies to the island, and not only bring supplies to the island, but also give information to the people that were coming here and making sure that they had a transition, that they knew where to get the resources, all those type of things. That was sort of at the community level. If we go to the next slide. Local government also got involved out here. So the city of Orlando, in particularly the city of Kissimmee, basically this is sir, when you got to the airport, this was the welcoming that you were receiving out here in terms of that. The city put resources together. Actually, they put together different agencies that had a resource center at the airport out here in terms of how to respond to that influx of people out here. And this was the time that we were hearing all those massive numbers of people living out here. So this was something that the local government was able to do. If we even go next slide, in terms of what the receiving community did here as well. So even the state government, when then Governor Scott declares a state of emergency for Hurricane Maria to support Puerto Rico. And obviously, this is a significant type of policy act in terms of that, responding to a situation that happened 1,200 miles away and declaring a state of emergency to deal with it as well. So next slide. In the case of Puerto Rico, it didn't end with Hurricane Maria. If there was such a preview of what 2020 was going to bring, sort of at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, that seismic fall that we knew was going to be activated sometime in the future came this year. And obviously, there were massive earthquakes in Puerto Rico as well. So now we're getting another sense of another disaster that is happening, another climate-related type of issue that is happening out here. And then move forward to March, we have COVID-19 as well. And in the case of COVID-19, with the travel restrictions, with the things that are going on, it has a potential to impede that kind of movement, that type of relationship that we have in terms of the different restrictions that we have out here. So basically, what happens when all of a sudden Orlando and Florida were such a sort of a place where people that were dealing with these experiences could move to. Now that gets truncated, and not only sort of the travel restrictions, but now sort of the economic realities of Central Florida being sort of a service type of industry place, and sort of the ramifications with that. And as you can see before, about 15% of the population has been lost out here in Puerto Rico from 2000 to 2019. And that's a massive reduction in terms of what's going to happen to the future of the island as well. And I'm going to end quickly, if we go to the next slide, in some of the research that we're studying out here. And I know that some of my colleagues and team members are on the webinar, so a shout out to them out here. But we were gracious enough to receive funding from the National Academies of Sciences, and through the Urban Institute, we're doing this study basically looking at capacity and change in the climate migrant receiving communities in the Gulf. And obviously this is sort of internal migration. We can have a discussion in terms of whether Puerto Rico resembles migration in the sense that we usually think about, sort of transboundary immigration as well. So if you go to the next slide, tells you a little bit more about the study in some of the areas that we're doing, but in terms of analyzing that local capacity to absorb some of the issues that we've discussed so far. So issues in terms of housing, financial services, jobs and economic development opportunities, healthcare providers, social, cultural, and recreational activities, which are vital for a community that is sort of absorbing a group of people that have been displaced by these weather events. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and obviously down the line, be on the lookout for the results of our study. It's underway, and basically with that, that's the next slide has my information out here, but I'm looking forward to the discussion and also the presentation from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. That was really interesting. And our next panelist on the webinar is Mari Perales from the Centro de los Derechos del Migrante. Mari, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here to talk about migrant migrant workers, climate change, and how it's affecting communities here. Well, first, can you switch the slide to the next one? Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to talk about who CDM and what our work is. We have offices in Mexico and the US, which allows us to follow migrant workers throughout their labor migration journey from the moment they're recruited in their communities in Mexico all the way to the US and back. Our core work is composed of 3 main areas: legal, outreach, and organizing, as well as policy. We conduct policy advocacy both in Mexico and in the US. We also have smaller areas like contratados, which is our Yelp++, like for migrant workers, where they can learn about their migrants' rights and they can review employers as well. And Promomi, which is a gender-focused area that also transverses all the other areas. Next slide, please. So who is the migrant worker and what types of workers do we work with? A migrant worker is typically a migrant worker who's recruited in their communities with a short-term visa. The majority of them are in agriculture, in the outside food, construction, crab picking, and other low-wage industries in the US. As again, they're coming in short-term visas, less than a year, often tied to their employers, meaning that their immigration status is contingent on being employed by this particular one employer. We typically work with migrant workers from Mexico, most low income, but have also served other migrant workers in the Dominican Republic, in Peru, and other areas. Next slide, please. I wanted to give a little context about the recruitment process because it does affect the opportunities and experience of migrant workers throughout. And it is very pervasive. Abuse often begins at the moment that workers are recruited. Here's a visual of where they're in Mexico, for instance, how there's several ways in which they're recruited. There's not a one uniform way, but often many workers have to pay hundreds or thousands in illegal fees to recruiters, this third person, for the opportunity to come work in the US and to work for a company. This often means that workers are arriving indebted, making it harder for them to report abuse in the workplace since they do depend on the job. And being fired often means being sent back to a debt that they will not be able to pay back. One thing we are hearing and we are seeing is that climate change is affecting the experience of migrant workers and their families. While we do not have concrete data, we have hear it, we see it, and we see it and receive calls for cases. Next slide, please. So I wanted to do some case studies to show how and what kind of things we're hearing from migrant workers on the ground. First off, here's some examples. During Hurricane Florence in 2018, we received calls from workers who were left stranded. So they lived in remote areas and spent most of their time working. So they hadn't heard of the storm coming because of spotty connection. When they did, it was too late. They depended on their work, on their employer to be able to transport themselves and evacuate, but their employer did not evacuate them in time. So they called us in fear that they were being flooded in. And for days after, they also talked to us about how hard it was for them to be able to receive food since the area they were in was very remote and very flooded in. Workers, when they come to in this short-term visas, they don't have their own car, their own transportation. They often are living in employer provided or employer facilitated housing. So their whole livelihoods, from getting food, from being able to go out beyond their workplace, depends on their employer. We also hear of migrant workers who are bearing the brunt of the wildfires. Farm workers face some of the lowest wages and higher levels of poverty. They have to choose between working in conditions with smoke or not being able to feed their families. We also know that they aren't receiving proper equipment, making it hard for them to breathe when working. Recently in California, there was a push for OSHA, and OSHA pushed employers to provide better masks that can also prevent not only COVID, but also smoke for the wildfires. And lastly, on our very backyard in Maryland, where CDM is based in the US, on a recent report breaking the shell, workers shared that they're struggling to pick crab, which is an already arduous task to do. Because of the quality of the crab, which has diminished throughout the years, many of them are struggling to meet their pound quotas, which they get paid by the pound versus getting paid hourly. They get maybe $3 to $4.50 per pound. And the time that it used to be able to pick one crab has increased, and meaning that now they make less wages in the same time that they would have years ago. Next slide, please. And then speaking about heat and how that is affecting, again, primarily low-income workers of color, immigrants who are suffering the risk of heat stress. There is no universal standard for worker climate conditions, so workers have been forced to work in ill-producing situations, risking their own lives to be able to support their own. In the case of Washington and California, a heat stress standard exists, but we hear from workers in Florida and Texas and Maryland that they're working on unbearable conditions with no access to set shade, water, or breaks to prevent hail illness, which we know is 100% preventable with the right protocols, but those are not in place. And as we know that the summer days are hotter than they were a century ago. So these are the kind of things that workers are having to face and work within. Lastly, we also are hearing from undocumented families. In Houston, for instance, during Hurricane Ike in 2017, many undocumented families did not evacuate, they did not leave their homes behind. And when they ended up being flooded in, many did not seek shelter, did not receive food from any agencies or even other organizations, in fear that it was connected to the government and that the government would disclose their immigration status, ultimately leading into deportation proceeding. But even after the hurricane, they lag behind in access to food and aid, again, facing the fears of deportation. As we look into the future and climate change, this is worrisome for advocates like myself in making sure that they're having access to necessary aid and timely during emergency situations. So what can we do to support? Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to these conversations. We need to continue having these conversations and making sure that as we're thinking about climate change, we're also thinking about migrants and immigrants, folks without immigration status, of different immigration status. This is an extremely vulnerable population, and we're seeing that it's bearing a lot of the brunt as climate change and other stressors are impacting it. We also are thinking about policy at the federal level, particularly for heat stress. There is a bill, Asunción Bambida Hail Illness and Fatality Prevention Act, that would direct OSHA to issue an occupational safety and health standard to protect workers from heat-related illnesses and injuries. Well, we know that won't cover all the different stressors. It's a very important one as we're thinking of all the workers that are working outside right now. And more broadly, climate and potential, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're thinking about it linguistically and culturally appropriate. Again, the linking any services or resources from immigration work status, and to make sure that we are reaching to this community, not only presenting information, but educating them on climate change and thinking of them when we're conducting research in a way that is also understood by them. Well, that was all for today, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari. That was really excellent. Thank you for introducing us to these communities and the threats and burdens they're facing from climate and policymaking up, from both ends of their journey. Really important. Our fourth panelist in the webinar, Dr. Kim Mosby, hopefully is joining us by phone.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, hi, Kim. So great.
How are you doing?
Please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Molly, are the slides up?
Yeah, they are, Kim.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. This is going to be entertaining. So I am in New Orleans. I currently don't have power, but we're going to make this work. So thank you for bearing with me today. My name is Kim Mosby, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist at the Coastal Sustainability Studio at Louisiana State University. And today I'm going to be telling you about one of the projects that we've been working on for the past couple of years. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about the flood of 2016, some underlying problems, the process that we've gone through for our research, before we talk about 3 themes for resiliency that have come out of our research, and then we're going to conclude. Next slide. The increasing convergence of inland and coastal communities through coastal erosion, sea level rise, rural to urban migration, and other factors is a phenomenon Louisiana is experiencing on an unparalleled scale, but the issue is not unique to the state. Following recent storms and aided by federal disaster funds, many residents have moved away from the Louisiana coast to reduce their risk, only to be flooded repeatedly from rain events over inland watersheds. And that's what happened between August 29th and August 15th in 2016. The greater Baton Rouge area flooded, and this is an area that had historically been touted as being safe. After Hurricane Katrina, the narrative in the area was if you leave New Orleans and you go towards Baton Rouge and you go to the North Shore and you go to many of these communities, these receiving communities, that you would be safe. And instead, people found out a decade later that they had to deal with flooding all over again. Next slide. In response to this, a team of researchers at LSU came together to create a project called Inland from the Coast, a multi-scalar approach to regional climate change responses. The project goal is to create a framework to restore and enhance community well-being in the face of extreme weather and climate change and support adaptation strategies for a sustainable future. As you can see, this project uses 3 different pieces of information. So we combine understanding of hydrology and ecosystems with community well-being research and have that inform design and policy interventions. And the red circles on the map indicate the different communities that we're working with. So that when we say multi-scalar, we have a community that's a neighborhood. We're working with 2 cities, and we're also working with a parish. And we've recently begun scaling up our ideas, and now we're working with the entire Amite River Basin region. Next slide. Oh, and we don't have to go back to the slide, but I do want to point out that the project is funded by the Gulf Research Program of the National Academies of the Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. As you can see, we have a very diverse team. It's a transdisciplinary team, as well as being an interdisciplinary team, which means that we cross disciplines, but we also leave the academic realm. And some of our project partners include local professionals with the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the American Planning Association. Next slide. So some of the underlying problems about why these receiving communities are now having increased flooding issues, it's really a combination of factors. There's hydraulic alteration, there's an increase in impervious surfaces as house sizes get bigger and lot sizes get smaller, and then there's also the pressures of suburban sprawl. Next slide. There's also this lack of vision, so that when plans are made, there's not always a follow-through to conserve the green space against development pressures. And so as you can see with this, there's a red box in the proposed park plan, and you can see in the center, if Molly clicks again, that a red box should appear, and this is the same area. So that you can see in 1948 that this space was designed, if it had been planned to be green space, the flooding inundation picture in the middle shows you that that green space is roughly where the flooding happened in 2016. And when you look at the far right-hand picture, you'll see that that's what actually exists inside of that red square. And you'll notice that it's not a natural channel, it's all concrete. And so this shows that the way that we're building is increasing risk and reducing community well-being. Next slide. For our process, we've done several different ways of collecting data. We've done policy and document analysis. We've had focus groups and interviews with residents, design professionals, city employees, and elected officials. We've done community-based planning and design processes with residents and design professionals. And we've also conducted surveys that allowed residents to identify and prioritize the elements necessary for their well-being, because we recognize that people live in communities for different reasons. And as such, no one-size-fits-all approach will work. And this is a picture of one way in which we did community engagement in the town of Denham Springs, which we're going to talk about next. And you can see this is the side of City Hall, and the mayor allowed us to, at their fall festival last year, to have people come up and write why they love Denham Springs. And it was so popular that the entire 30-foot side of the building was covered. Every brick had words written about why people love their community. Next slide. So out of this work, there have been 3 themes that have emerged. First, living with water, meaning that we have to change the way that we think about water. We can't just engineer our way out of solutions. There are some places that never should have been built in. And there are other places where we can turn drainage from an annoyance into an amenity. And this is all predicated on creating space for stormwater in the landscape. Our second theme is connected communities, being able to provide the ability for all community members, regardless of age, ability, or access to resources, to move around their community safely. And when we're talking about connections, we mean both inside of a community, but also connecting communities to each other, because often communities have different access to resources. And through facilitating connections, resources can be shared easily, can be accessed more easily. Our third theme was design for active living, meaning that we need to identify and invest in the design elements and programming that allow recreation to be a year-round endeavor. This can mean, in our region, things like shade, having benches, having adequate lighting, but also having food options, because culture is a huge part of life down here. And also that when people are outside, there are certain activities that they're used to doing. So having barbecues, having the crawfish boil, and thinking about how we design spaces to allow people to celebrate their culture inside of them. And then also when you start to layer these things together, it's possible to design infrastructure improvements that provide all 3 and provide multiple benefits. Next slide. So this is a map of our study area in Denham Springs. Denham Springs is a receiving community. We conducted a mental health survey of residents who were flooded in 2016, and we found that over 10% of our survey respondents indicated that they flooded in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and then they flooded in their new home inside of this inland region in 2016, stating that they had moved so that they wouldn't flood again, but then 11 years later, they were going through the same process. And so in Denham Springs, this area, while it's seen as a safe community, the historic town center is a repetitive flood loss area. And the city is currently working on a buyout program and has asked us to help them create a vision for how to use this space after the buyout to avoid the area becoming blighted with illegal dumping. The designers organized resident desires into 4 nodes. So we have the education and history node to the north, which is the historic town center when Denham Springs originally formed. To the east, there's the culture and art zone. To the south, we have a recreation or active node. And then the 4th area is a conservation wooded wetlands area. And all of this will help alleviate flooding, not just in this neighborhood, but also in the downtown area as well. Next slide. And as you can see from this programming map, that in the active zone, we have things like a skate park and a dog park and places that can become retention basins. But then we also have a nature area with trails so that people can go out and explore and be in nature, which has proven benefits for both mental and physical well-being. We also have in the arts and culture area, there's an amphitheater that will allow space for the festival culture that exists, but also can double as a retention area so that if there's flooding along the canal, there's a basin to collect that water and to keep it out of the downtown area. And we've also added circulation so that there's more connections between the downtown area and the expanded park area. But you can also see that in this design for the buyout of this neighborhood, that our design shows that there are still houses in the center, because this community recognizes that not everybody is going to move. And so they plan to increase their building regulations to make sure that when people build back in this area, that they're increasing their resiliency through design practices. But also, we're creating more space for water to be in the neighborhood. So hopefully, the areas that don't have houses now can continue to be green space and will be able to hold flood water, which could reduce pressure on some of the other houses still in that area. Next slide. In conclusion, we've seen that receiving communities may have their own risks, although social narratives may present these communities as safe. Relocation has the potential to move people away from risk, but they often are moving to a risk that they don't understand. And households and communities need support when relocating to ensure that they reduce their risk and that they understand the potential risk in their new location. Next slide. Thank you so much. I appreciate you listening today.
And thank you, Kim. You really went above and beyond joining us. I hope that you and your family and community are faring safe with Hurricane Zeta now passing Louisiana. That brings us to the end of the presentations and to a question and answer period that might go a few minutes over the hour, if you'll indulge us. I'd like to thank all our attendees. You made my job a little bit easier in the sense that for folks who registered and submitted questions, you submitted some really thoughtful and excellent questions well in advance for our panelists. So I'd like to start with a question first for all of our panelists that came in through a registration. How can we as advocates or policymakers and researchers identify using modeling and other tools and then prepare regions and localities that may be more favorable than others as destinations for climate migrants due to, for example, their ability to accommodate growth, scale adequate social services for vulnerable migrants, or perhaps due to their past experience in policymaking in response to in-migration?
I could just sort of some of the things that I know in terms of, I think, from the social aspect of it, keeping in tune with, your demographics of, and including more people in the discussion as well, especially, migrant farm workers and other populations that sometimes are not there. But we know, it's becoming increasingly the use of geographical type of tools in terms of vulnerability indexes that can help you in your decision making. That's becoming more common across cities and across municipalities out there. Obviously, the social and economic indicators, there's tools out there. I don't have any specific to suggest out there, but there are certainly a lot of information, a lot of tools that can be used to inform that decision making in terms of, who's prepared for this situations out here. And I think a lot of the leadership is also involved in some of the issues in terms of, are you going to be a receiving community or not in terms of that, and that creates other issues that we haven't discussed in terms of public safety and all the types of issues that we usually don't discuss. But I think looking at this a holistic type of view, I think is the way to go in terms of that, and there's certainly a lot of tools out there.
Yeah, and this is Matt, and I want to echo that too, and just say that there's a lot of things that municipalities and cities and states and regions can do to make them an attractive destination for climate migrants. And most of it just involves making your city or your place a more livable and better community. So that includes things like affordable housing and housing prices. It involves economic development. It involves outreach efforts. Sometimes it involves advertising and so on into areas, in particular related to climate change, where you might see climate migrants originating from. To say, hey, my community is a great place to go. If you're thinking about relocating, we've got jobs, it's a friendly city, the housing market might be affordable, there's affordable housing, you can get more, your dollar goes further here, and the climate might be nicer, and so on, right? So these are all things that cities can do without necessarily requiring a lot of heavy-duty modeling efforts in order to identify, hey, this is what I can do to attract climate migrants, to kind of get into that game.
I think from our perspective, also making sure that the information is in the languages of the climate migrants. What we're hearing from workers is sometimes the news, they don't even understand what that means, or they don't understand even what climate change encapsulates. So making sure that that information is accessible, that they are understanding culturally, but also linguistically, and then that there are resources for them to be able to connect and learn more about in their own areas.
Yeah, Mari, I was, really struck by the experience, the precarity and vulnerability of the temporary workers that you are serving, particularly as they experience Hurricane Florence, as you described, and I think the challenges of with employer furnished housing, and of course now extreme heat on the job. And I'm wondering, whether that's in Maryland or North Carolina, for example, if you could speak a little bit to the state, but maybe especially the local government response to this in-migration of temporary workers or immigrants in general, and a little bit about sort of the need for a response from local government, and what positive or negative you've seen local government doing in Maryland and elsewhere.
Well, in Maryland, I think we have the issue that the crab industry is very beloved. And so often the worry is for the industry itself and not so much for the workers who are there doing the jobs. So what we're seeing is that in many cases, the direct response is to make sure that the employers are protected, even if that doesn't include workers. And for us, that is a big concern. It should always be those who are most vulnerable, most at risk. What we would love to see in Maryland is have some kind of form of standards, some protections at the local level even. For instance, right now, workers are having a lot of trouble accessing basic things like gloves and whatnot. In conditions, they also face similar issues in terms of hurricanes, where they live in the Eastern Island, and you have to drive through this very narrow road that overflooded. And the employers also live in this community, but they were flooded in for a few weeks as well. If there was at least some kind of protocol or an attempt, an active, proactive attempt to making sure there's measures in place for when this natural disasters are happening, and they're taking into account this vulnerable populations, for us, that would itself be a win. Because I think we were still very in the early stages where this conversations are really not thinking about migrant workers as part of those communities.
Thank you. So I have a question for Dr. Rivera, but I actually think I'd like to hear Dr. Fernando, if you could start by answering it first. I'd like to get responses from others. This question is, are there any data about the demographic profile of Puerto Ricans moving to Florida, migrating to Florida? I think, more recently, right, with Hurricane Maria. And then I'd like to add to that question, beyond what does that demographic profile tell us, if anything, about the impact of that outmigration on the sending community in Puerto Rico, and then again the demographic profile of those in-migrants to the receiving communities in Florida?
So I had the opportunity to be guest editor for a special edition of Hurricane Maria before and after the population of Puerto Rico before and after Hurricane Maria for Population and Environment. Is volume 42. So you can definitely look at that, and it tells you a little bit of the patterns. But in terms of the profile, right? Sort of the people, the profile of the people that are moving to Florida, they tend to be younger. Kind of like in the high 30s, 40s range, which is the opposite of the demographic profile in Puerto Rico that tends to be older. And that actually creates some of those issues in terms of that. In terms of even, reacting to some of these extreme events out here. We saw a lot of the things that were happening in Hurricane Maria. It was that elderly in more rural areas that didn't have necessarily family, but they have physical restrictions also as well, in terms of the preparation and the movement and getting ready to face a storm, and then the recovery out there. So as Puerto Rico loses population, and this is cutting across all social class type of patterns, which it was a little bit different before. So in Florida and other places, they're gaining sort of the productive years of a lot of people, while at the same time in Puerto Rico, the profile looks a little bit older in terms of that. Not to say that, we have a young generation that is trying to make a significant change also in Puerto Rico as well. But unless, the fatal, I would say the fatal combination between economic struggles and climate-related type of issues is not necessarily a good outlook for the island moving forward.
Thank you, Fernando. Matt, could you tell us anything about the demographic data for projected migrants, and again, how you see that might affect sending communities and receiving communities?
I can, if you give me like 30 seconds.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I would love to ask sort of a big, one that I think is probably we're all thinking about at some level, but this gets us to address it maybe quite explicitly. What is the research community doing? What is the advocacy community doing to directly confront issues of racism and class, income discrimination in sort of these domestic dynamics of climate displacement and migration, but as well, of course, during these times with transnational immigration as well?
I could say from sort of the social science disaster research groups, right? We've been very aware of the inequalities involved out there in terms of, even the capacity of the diversity of our emergency managers, cultural training, all sort of things. We've seen a lot of the times when, especially the research community, they will go to these places where disasters have happened, and they go in without that cultural knowledge, with no real ties to the community, and just treat people just as research subjects. So we're making sure that we do that. And actually, there's different groups that are forming out there to actually address these issues out here in terms of justice, equity, and leadership as well, to make sure that we take into account this when we do our research, especially when it's more of a extreme events in terms of disaster situations. They left me alone. I'm the only panelist.
David, you had asked about demographics, right?
Yeah.
So there's two broad secular demographic trends that are occurring in the United States right now. One is toward a more diverse United States populace, and that's across the board. That's essentially everywhere. You have states that are like California or Florida or Texas that are the leading edge of that demographic change, and then you have other states that are behind that, and some far behind, like Wyoming, which is much further behind. It doesn't look like the U.S. does right now, and it might not look like the U.S. looks right now for another 40 or 50 years. So there's one around diversity, and the second is around aging, that the U.S. population is going to begin to rapidly age in the latter half of the century. It's aging now. It's just that a lot of aging is going to start happening after about 2050 in the U.S. And so both of those secular trends affect what we should anticipate will happen around climate migration as well, and that future migrants, climate migrants, internally in the United States are much more likely to be non-white and older in terms of their demographic profiles. And so if you think about areas that are most at risk to climate change, the U.S. South and the Southwest in particular, those regions that already are relatively demographically diverse today will become really demographically diverse by the end of the century. And at the same time, they'll be a lot older. So if you're thinking about receiving communities in climate migrants, you have to think about migrants that are going to be non-white and more than likely elderly as well, if they choose to migrate as being elderly. So that has really strong impacts in terms of adaptation strategies in origin communities, thinking about aging in place already now, and adaptation strategies that would benefit a diverse and an aged population. But it also has effects in receiving communities as well, since the migrants are not going to probably look like the way you think they're going to look like now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Maria, I guess I'd like to offer you the last word before we turn it over to Molly to close this out.
Thank you. And I wanted to answer the question about racial justice and thinking about that more intentionally. I think, you know, as the entire nation, we're working to think about that more intentionally, doing better, pushing ourselves to do better. What we know is that we do, in many ways, workers of color, people of color are going to be disproportionately affected by global climate change. So we need to make sure that those folks are at the center. We also need to be cognizant that there's a lot of folks at the ground, smaller organizations, smaller groups leading a lot of work, and paying attention to them. They know how to best protect their own, and making sure that they're included in those conversations, particularly how they're affecting them. I think that could be a very good first step to making sure that we're going to be addressing this in an inclusive way, and really uplifting those that are going to be most affected by. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. And I do want to say a big thank you to David for moderating today, and thank you to all our panelists for joining. Kim also sent her regrets. She had to jump off the line, but she welcomes anyone who has direct questions to email her. You can find her email in the presenter handout, as with the rest of the panelists. So with that, thank you for attending today. And I just want to reiterate that we'll be sending the recording for this session out to you all next week. And we'll also be posting it on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, where you can find hundreds of other adaptation resources, case studies, and tools, things like that about climate adaptation. So I also want to welcome you to join our final panel for the Displacement Forum series is on November 5th about policy considerations at multiple scales. That will kind of incorporate everything the series has talked about. So hope you can make it then. And finally, we invite you to join our online networking platforms. Follow us at whatever your preferred network is. And yeah, on behalf of EcoAdapt, I hope you all have a really great day. Stay safe. And for those of you dealing with Hurricane Zeta, hang in there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.